In the summer of 1873, the last great intertribal battles between two of the most powerful tribes on the Great Plains took place. The Pawnee, out on their last free buffalo hunt, would be ambushed by their longtime enemies, the Lakota. The results would shock the entire nation. This is the story of the horrors of Massacre Canyon. Southwestern Nebraska, August 5, 1873. A group of Pawnee hunters crouched low in the prairie grass so as not to betray their silhouettes against the pre-dawn skyline. They are led by a respected tribal leader, Sky Chief. Amongst the hunters is Sky Chief's young son, a young boy who is no more than 6 or 7 years old. Though too young to participate in this hunt, he is excited and proud to be along with this group of grown men whom he idolizes and so often emulates. Their quarry on this summer morning is a herd of buffalo, several hundred strong, from which the Pawnee hope to harvest a sizable bounty of hides, horns, and hooves, as well as stores of invaluable meat, organs, and fat that will see them through another harsh plains winter. The Pawnee had once been a formidable force on the central plains of the North American continent. In the early 1700s, they had numbered 60,000 people and controlled vast swaths of what is today the American Midwest. But after almost 2 centuries of disease and warfare, their numbers have dwindled to a few thousand. By 1873, they have acquiesced to the U.S. government's attempt to confine them to reservation lands in Nebraska. This buffalo hunt, a long-standing tradition amongst the tribe, had only been granted to them in the previous few years as a final opportunity to practice their ways and to fortify their winter food supply at little to no cost to the federal government. The year prior, in 1872, they had been accompanied by a contingent of agency scouts led by Texas Jack Umahundro, a legendary scout, cowboy, eventual actor, and longtime friend of Buffalo Bill Cody. As the agency scouts stood watch and provided protection to the camp, the Pawnee men were able to venture out to hunt without fear of retributive attacks from their longtime enemy, the Lakota. Under the watchful eye of well-armed sentries, the Pawnee had managed to procure enough buffalo meat to get them through the upcoming winter. However, the Lakota had raided their reservation incessantly during the winter of 1872 to 1873, and the Pawnee suffered greatly as a result. In the springtime, the Pawnee chiefs conferred and decided that another hunt was indeed wholly necessary for the survival of their tribe. They petitioned the federal agents of the reservation for another contingent of scouts. They requested that these scouts be led by Texas Jack, as he had comported himself so reputably during the summer prior, and thus solidified a lifelong respect and companionship between himself and the Pawnee. But in the interim time between the summer of 1872 and the spring of 1873, several major changes had occurred in the administration of the Pawnee Reservation, known as the Genoa Agency. First, a new superintendent had been installed. His name was William Burgess, and like his predecessors since 1869, he was a Quaker. President Ulysses S. Grant had installed Quakers as Indian agents in the hopes that contact with pacifist, peaceable whites would quell the raging frontier violence that had plagued the continent for centuries and stalled American expansion for decades. Grant, in fact, believed that the root cause of much of the violence on the bleeding frontier was due to the treatment of the native tribes by the overly aggressive, needlessly bellicose, and haplessly short-sighted settlers. He hoped this plan would stem the tide of violence that, at times, seemed like it might overrun a third of the country, but he would be gravely disappointed. From the very start, William Burgess had not inspired confidence in his leadership abilities. Luther North, a revered member of the Scouts that had served the reservation, described Burgess as woefully unqualified, noting that, quote, "His judgment where the Pawnee are concerned, if anything, is poorer than any of the other agents the Pawnees have had." Burgess had attempted to address the terrible situations at the reservation by passing out annual rations earlier than promised, but this proved an inadequate solution to the poverty and starvation that plagued the tribe. Feeling as though he had little other feasible course of action, Burgess authorized the tribe to travel to the Republican River in hopes of repeating the previous year's hunting success and placating the Pawnee for one last year until they could be brought fully to bear as idealized American citizens. The plans for the excursion began in late spring, with the initial intent being to repeat the steps taken in the previous year's hunt. Texas Jack was asked to lead the agency's scouting party, and a wave of much-needed hopefulness spread through the desperate, hungry camp as spring turned to summer. However, due to an administrative oversight on behalf of the reservation agents, the Pawnee were ultimately unable to secure Texas Jack's services. Though he had repeatedly applied to lead the Pawnee party, no word had come in return. With no confirmatory word from the Genoa agency, Texas Jack had signed on to appear in Buffalo Bill Cody's stage show in New York, and was thus drawn away by his new obligation. The Pawnee, now bereft of an agency representative they considered trustworthy in the field, beseeched Burgess to grant the position to a 22-year-old Wisconsin-born homesteader named John W. Williamson. Williamson had signed on that spring as an agriculturalist for Fort Genoa, and had solidified a mutually congenial relationship with the Pawnee. He had no experience in guiding on the trail, no experience in the territory, and spoke only passable Pawnee, and, being all too keenly aware of these facts himself, had never applied for nor expressed any interest in leading the Pawnee hunting expedition. The Pawnee hoped that this might work in their favor, as Williamson's lack of territorial and tactical wherewithal would likely mean drastically less strict practices than those employed by Texas Jack. This hunt could very well be their last hurrah on the Great Plains, and the Pawnee did not want it interfered with by what they viewed as an overly restrictive white man, no matter how reputable, well-liked, and well-intentioned Texas Jack may have been. Burgess, believing he had no better immediate options, acquiesced to the Pawnee's request for Williamson to be installed as the nominal leadership. The Pawnee had ventured out from Fort Genoa in a party of roughly 400, mostly women and children. They had made their way, in high spirits, to the hunting grounds on the Republican River, believing themselves adequately protected and free of some of the previous year's more burdensome restrictions. Initially, the hunt had been a rousing success. In the month of hunting leading up to this day, the Pawnee had managed to harvest roughly 800 buffalo. Each animal killed means a measure of security for their families, and all present have, thus far, been pleased with their progress. On this day, though, something is different. The air seems unusually thick, and the buffalo more skittish than usual. The evening prior, a group of white buffalo hunters had stopped by the Pawnee encampment. They had warned Williamson and Sky Chief that they had seen a large encampment of the Pawnee's mortal enemy, the Lakota, 25 miles upriver. They had warned that the Lakota party was clearly on the warpath and undoubtedly on the hunt for the Pawnee. Word had spread quickly amongst the Lakota that the Pawnee were back this summer on the Republican River, lands that the Lakota hold to be rightfully theirs. The white hunters had warned that the Lakota were out for blood. Sky Chief had scoffed at this notion and decried the hunters as simply more lying white men, trying to keep him and his people from their rightful hunting grounds. But now, as he hunkers down watching the buffalo herd and mindfully keeping his young son close to him, Sky Chief begins to wonder if those hunters had in fact been telling the truth. Then he hears the hoofbeats. Suddenly, a party of 50 Lakota warriors on horseback and in full war regalia crests the ridge behind the Pawnee. Almost instantaneously, the two parties, Lakota and Pawnee, are in sight of each other. Some accounts have Sky Chief and his warriors as being in the middle of skinning some of the buffalo they have already killed. However, in either account, the Pawnee have been caught wholly unprepared to defend themselves. It is clear to Sky Chief at a moment's glance that this small party of Lakota are the initial scouts sent out to find and make first contact with the Pawnee. He knows that the contingent now attacking himself and his warriors is likely but a fraction of the entire Lakota force. As the Lakota let loose their piercing war cries and barrel down the ridge towards them, The Pawnee hunting party knows there will be no surviving this morning. Within moments, Sky Chief, his young son, and the remainder of his forces are cut down. The Lakota will later report taking no prisoners from this attack, leaving all Pawnee present lying still in death. Having located their enemy, the Lakota reconnaissance party of roughly 50 warriors makes their way back to the main contingent of Lakota, roughly 1,000 strong, hidden behind a bluff a few miles away. After being alerted by the reconnaissance party, this larger war party, under the leadership of War Chiefs Littletail and the aptly named Pawnee Killer, immediately ride out towards the remainder of the Pawnee. The remaining Pawnee, with only 100 warriors left and the rest being women and children, are making their way down a canyon near the Republican River when the Lakota smash into them in a whirlwind of violence and bloodshed. The battle that further ensues is unbelievably fierce, with every man present knowing that the fate of his family would be the same as that of Sky Chief, his men, and his young son. Though they fight valiantly, the majority of the Pawnee warriors are simply and quickly overwhelmed and cut down. Williamson and 2 older Pawnee men managed to make an escape back to the west in hopes of linking up with the nearest U.S. Army element in the area and procuring assistance. However, they will not make it back in time. The surviving Pawnee women and children have retreated into the canyon and are now trapped within its recesses. One by one, young and old are ruthlessly hunted down and taken prisoner, or immediately dispatched at the end of Lakota arrows and lances. Though many are cut down, many are taken prisoner, all of them knowing that their fates now will likely be worse than their deceased comrades. Any valuables that can be carried are tied down to Lakota horses. Then, almost as suddenly as they had struck, the entire party of Lakota, with their newly taken trophies and prisoners in tow, are off, over the hills, and seemingly free from worry of pursuit or retribution. Only hours later, in the afternoon of August 5th, U.S. cavalry soldiers who had been alerted by Williamson and his cohorts arrive on the scene. Riding with them is Army Dr. David Franklin Powell. Surveying the horrific scene, he counts 59 Pawnee bodies. Visitors from nearby towns, who have been alerted to the events and come to see the aftermath themselves, count there to be significantly more. Correspondent Royal Buck of the Nebraska City News wrote that it was a massacre and nothing more, and nearly 100 victims are lying on the ground, and 2/3 are squaws and papooses, small Indian children. On August 8th, news of the massacre reaches the Pawnee back at the Genoa Agency. For days afterwards, the fort is a cacophonous scene as the weeping and lamentations of the Pawnee women fill the air. Meanwhile, a few Pawnee who have managed to escape the canyon make their way 80 miles to what's known as Plum Creek, an offshoot of the Platte River. Here, they are tended to by Dr. William M. Bancroft, and then put on a train back to Fort Genoa. For weeks afterwards, Lakota warriors are spotted in various camps about the prairies, proudly displaying their war trophies. In a visceral display of the generations-long enmity between the two tribes, it is apparent to outside observers that what had been a horrific massacre to the Pawnee was a just and necessary victory in the eyes of the Lakota, one that, by its very nature, warranted great pride and celebration. Lakota accounts of the battle report as many as 300 Pawnee being killed, with no Lakota casualties being taken. The events of Massacre Canyon in 1873 are, to be sure, unique, but not in their level of ferocity, nor in the scope of their violence, nor in the intensity of the disdain between the two tribes, nor the grief inflicted and suffered by both. Instead, Massacre Canyon will be unique in the history of the Old West because it will mark the last great battle between Plains tribes on the North American continent. However, in the scope of history, the stories of warfare, raiding, violence, and atrocities between tribes are too numerous to cover in one episode. For tonight, those are other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us. If you like this story, click on one of the videos on your screen now to hear more. Also, if you'd like to learn more about Old West history, be sure to sign up for the HOKC newsletter. Link is in the description. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.